Good morning, everyone. Q here. Welcome to DTF Garage. Today I'm going to be talking to you about my 2014 Touareg with a 3-liter turbo diesel engine. And I've just kind of run into my first, I wouldn't call it major, but maintenance issue that's known with these engines. Based on the video title, that's what's bringing you here. So I'm going to talk to you a little bit through what I've got, the signs and symptoms, and then we'll talk about the parts, some of the tools I've got, and the strategy going forward. So first off, some of the symptoms that I've been having is I wouldn't call it a leak, but the fluid levels for both coolant and oil have been going down. I've noticed in about the last 15,000 miles that I was losing about half a quart of oil based on the measurements inside the cabin. And then I've been experiencing low coolant levels for about the last 5,000 miles. And I was only driving maybe 3-4 times a week, I don't know, 30-40 miles, and it was dropping about an inch in the reservoir. With that, I kind of looked at the exhaust while it was running. I didn't see any white smoke, which would identify coolant in the combustion chamber, i.e. Leaky head gasket. Didn't see that, so I don't believe I have that. Then I've also looked underneath. There was no coolant and or oil dripping underneath. So it's not really going anywhere. I wasn't burning oil. I don't see any smoke, black smoke or dark gray smoke either. So I'm not burning any coolant or oil. So it's going somewhere and it's not dripping down underneath the vehicle. So it needs to be going somewhere else. So looking through some of the forums, I've come across a couple issues that are known, and one of those being the coolant bypass valve on the top and the oil cooler section developing leaks, and those sit right down inside the V of the top of this engine. And what happens is they leak out and it just kind of pools on the top, and eventually you might get some oil spilling over, or in my case I think I had the coolant was just boiling off, because I'll show you in a little bit here. When we take the cover off, it kind of splattered a little bit. There's some residue from boiling coolant, it looks like, and then it disintegrated the foam underneath this plastic cover. So I kind of knew this was coming. I've been reading up on the forums just to get ready for it, and then about 2 weeks ago I went in for a wheel alignment on this because I put new tires on, and the technician that was working on it had me come over to the vehicle and showed me oil leaking. I think he cleaned it up, but he had oil up over this. Oil was down in here. He had the cover off. Oil was dripping down underneath. So I'm not sure exactly what he did. I think they, not to talk bad, but I think they may have staged it a little bit to make it look worse than what really is. But either way, I knew that was coming, and it was confirmed by a Volkswagen technician. And he actually had another Volkswagen Touareg that he was doing the exact same job on a couple bays over. So he went and took me over to it and showed me down inside the valley. He had it all torn out. So I thought it wasn't that hard to look at and get into. So I'm going to go ahead and try it myself. Some of the parts that we're looking at. Actually, we can start first with these printouts I've got. So they identified the oil cooler, which is this part here. I've got one of those. That sits on top of a plate, and that plate sits on top of the engine block. There's 2 seals between that plate and the engine block, and then there's a seal between the plate and the oil cooler. Then off to the side here, you can see the coolant bypass valve. To my understanding, what that does is it, at a certain temperature, the valve is actuated, and it allows coolant to pass between the water jacket around the cylinders into the main system of the coolant system. And those are known to leak. I've got one of those right here. On the side of this, I believe it's right here where it pivots, the actuator pivots. There's a seal inside of this that can go bad, and that's where the coolant is known to leak out of. In order to do this, the tough part is that we are underneath So there's some of the other parts that I've got set up here to replace. I got an extra one of these. This is one of the seals or gaskets. I got gaskets for both the oil cooler and that adapter plate. And then I've got seals for the intake manifold. There's 2 different sizes, and then you need 6 of each. There's this little gasket on this flange set, and I just bought that. I think that was only a couple dollars. The most expensive parts were this. This was like $130, and this was about $100. I don't know that the oil cooler itself is actually leaking. I think it may just be the seal. So what I may do is, once we get the one that's in the vehicle out, I'll do a pressure test. I'll tape off, I think it's just the coolant port, and I'll pressurize it to a couple pounds and submerge this in water, and we'll see if air bubbles come out. That'll tell us if there's some sort of leak in the system. I doubt it's actually this, so got it just in case, because I'm going to be in there. A couple of tools I've got. We'll go in there and scope it and see what it looks like before I start tearing it up. I bought this little wet and dry vac because my intent is not to drain the coolant or the oil from the car. So what I'll do is once I start pulling connections off and there starts being fluids on the top, we'll go ahead and suck that all out and just make sure it's all clean. And then I got a coolant vacuum purge and refill kit in case I do actually end up having some air in the system and need to drain it completely. I can refill it with this. And then I've got an estimate from AutoNation. This is to replace the oil cooler, the coolant switch, which is that bypass valve, and then all the seals and gaskets that come with it. They quoted me for all that work $3,128.92. All in all, with the parts that I've got sitting right here, I'm at $336.51. Then plus the couple of tools that I bought. You may have some of this stuff on hand or can borrow it from somebody else too. So that's where we're at with all that. Moving forward, the strategy is going to be, we'll remove this cover, we'll borescope, and then we'll start dismantling the intake. Alright, taking a look under the engine beauty cover here. It's got 4 pins that it sits on. Here, 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 and here. And you can see up underneath here, I've got some fluids being flung around, and that's not oily, so probably some coolant. I can't really tell the color, maybe a little bit red or pink, which is what coolant is colored in these vehicles. So there was like a foam piece that is typically attached on this area right here, and that was pretty much falling apart and disintegrating. I'm guessing from the steam of the coolant being boiled off. Now I can see without the cover on, we're looking at a pretty convoluted piece of machinery here, and this is probably going to be the toughest part of this build, or this repair, is getting this intake manifold off, because it's tucked underneath these cable trays, and I believe there's even a high pressure fuel line that runs across the back somewhere in there. And I may end up cracking that line open, which if you're not comfortable with that, then maybe this job isn't for you. But if you crack that line open, when you go to start it the first time back through, it'll repressurize and fill that line. It's just going to be a delay, so it'll be turning over like it's not going to start for a little bit, and we'll see that at the end of this. But yeah, generally appearance of the engine is pretty clean. There's not a bunch of oil all over the place. There's a little bit I can see down on this passenger side where it might be trickling down, but right underneath here, this is the EGR cooler. So intake's got to come off, EGR cooler comes off, and then underneath that is the oil cooler, and then right behind it is where that coolant bypass valve is. So we'll start by taking this intake pipe off, and I've already shown that in my other video where I showed the cleaning of the carbon on these components right here. So if you want to check that out, you can see how to remove this, but we'll pick it back up when I'm starting to take the intake off. Alright, we're going to bore the back of this. I believe we can see some of the oil cooler back here. So there's the oil cooler in the top of that video, and you can see there's definitely some oil in the bottom of that. And it looks like it was at a higher level. You can kind of see an oil level mark on the side of this cooler. And I believe when I had it in there, the technician went in and sucked it out as much as he could, which did me a solid for a little bit. But yeah, you can definitely see it in there. A little something on the side. Oh. There's the top of the engine and that plate. Definitely have some crud in there. So that confirms oil leak in the top of the engine. Alright, now that we've got the intake pipe removed, you can see we've still got quite a bit of stuff on top of the intake manifold to actually get it to come up and out. I think it comes up and forward of the vehicle. Next steps are going to be this cable tray here with coolant pipes. There's 2 bolts, one on each side, and a little clip, retaining clip on the underside in the middle here. That should lift up and back. We need to remove some of these vacuum lines from brackets that are on the intake manifold itself. A couple of these electrical connectors that are in brackets on the intake. We've got coolant bypass or coolant head solenoid that needs to be disconnected and removed. We've got the coolant temp sensor. We've got a fuel pressure sensor. And I believe that is the majority of what needs to come out and out of the way before we can get to the bolts. I believe there's 8 bolts T30s holding the intake manifold in. I've got a picture on the manual. I can put a picture in picture of that when I get to this point. You can kind of see on here, this is the cable tray, this white residue. I think that's from coolant boiling off. All right, now that gives us access to this high pressure line across the top. That'll be the next thing to come off. Alright, I'm going to start removing the bolts now for the intake manifold. It looks like we got 12, so we got 1 near the front side of each runner. And then we've got 3 more along the side and back. And then 4 kind of centrally located. And it looks like the one on each side of the back are probably going to be the most difficult ones to get to. There's not a whole lot of room for fuel lines, so I'm going to try just a T30 Allen head or key. See how that works. Alright, about 5 minutes of finagling. I got this intake out of here. You can see there is some carbon buildup in these, so we'll go ahead and clean all these runners out. The other thing I did have to remove is this fuel pressure sensor on this side of the driver's side rail. And it was kind of getting caught up on that, so I removed that. Then I kind of tilted it up and wiggled it out, and it came out fairly easily. About 5 minutes of jerking around. I didn't break anything, so it all looks good. So on to the next here. We can see now that we have access to the EGR cooler. I believe that's just removing this hose and this clamp back here, and then there's a couple of periphery bolts that we need to remove. I will say, in order to get this intake off, get one of these long T30s and you'll be good to go as far as getting into these back ones that are really tight to get to. Alright, you can see the red, it's all coolant, and there's quite a bit of oil down in there as well. Down here, that's the coolant bypass valve. So next we'll suck all this out, and then we'll start by removing this oil cooler. That'll get us better access to these two over here. Alright, we got that all cleaned up. We could see the oil cooler a little bit better and where it mounts. There's 6 bolts around the perimeter of it, and then this one hose clamp right here that you need to remove. But it looks like in order to gain access to the one bolt that's underneath here, we'll have to remove this little flange here. So we already took one of those bolts out with the EGR cooler, and it's got one more right there, and then that hose clamp. We were going to be replacing this part anyway, so it needs to come out regardless, because it's got a gasket underneath. That is this part right here. Alright, now we're going to remove this bypass valve. Looks like there's 3 bolts. And then we should be able to get to this plate in between. Yeah, there's quite a bit of crud around this. Let's vacuum that up before the oil gets down inside. Looks like there's 4 bolts for this as well. Alright, we'll do a little bit of cleaning around here. Yeah, there's definitely some oil deposits. And then start putting some seals back and clean the parts up. Alright, we got everything down here in the valley cleaned up. This is all pretty deep with just gunked up oil probably from getting cooked over and over again. It was really thick and pasty. Same with this area here. And then I cleaned up all the surfaces for the gaskets, and then cleaned up that transition plate and put new gaskets on both sides of that. So this one that goes around the periphery, this little guy, it's got an indexing nub there, so you put it right the orientation. And then same on the other side. And then cleaned up this mating surface here for the gasket on the bypass valve. I did notice while taking the gasket out of this transition plate, there is some coolant on both sides of this gasket, so this is likely the culprit for my coolant leak, and or maybe even the oil leak on the other side. Alright, the 4 bolts for this plate, as well as the ones that go on this this valve, are tightened down to 9 Newton meters. Alright, now we can put the oil cooler on. And that's got locating pins, so it'll only go in one position there. And these bolts are all 9 millimeters as well. Alright, my junction elbow that I purchased did not come with this gasket ring right here, so I took that off the old piece. And you'll need that because the EGR cooler has a metal connector that sits over the top of this, and that's how it gets fed its coolant. Then also don't forget to reattach your vacuum line to that bypass valve. Alright, about to put the intake manifold back on. Cleaned up the surfaces, the mating surfaces on the heads. Got new seals on the intake. Buttoned up a couple connections. The pipe clamp or the hose clamp on the EGR cooler. The electrical connection on this electrical valve here on the EGR cooler. And then the connection to the turbo for the, or maybe not the turbo, I'm not exactly sure. That's the source of the exhaust gas pipe. And then make sure we've got this kind of set off to the way. This does go underneath the intake and it should sit right around here once it's reinstalled. So we'll just kind of keep it low so it doesn't get caught on the intake going in. There are a couple of locating pins on the intake. They sit higher than the seals, so those will hit first. As you're guiding it in, you might get caught on something like that. The front two actually sit on holes in the intake. The rear two looks like they just capture the edge of the head. All right, let's see if we can sneak this guy in here. I did clean up this intake on the inside with a pipe cleaner on the end of a drill, and that seemed to clear things up a little bit. All right, we got it in. So when you're putting this back in on the passenger side and the rear, you gotta make sure you get the back of it underneath that fuel line back here. Otherwise you'll get caught up on this side. And on the driver's side, I kind of had to lower this portion of it before it got to this valve and the fuel rail here, because it was too fat to fit in between there, wedging it down. So I kind of entered it from in front of there. And then same on this side, kind of entered the back passenger corner below that fuel rail, and it went right back in. And everything seems to line up. I don't have any gaskets poking out, so everything should still be in the right orientation. All right, so I started by installing all the bolts just with a magnetic wand, snaking them all into their specific locations. So now we're ready to start tightening. Now there is a specific tightening sequence to this, and it starts with the 4 inside bolts. So the one right here, right back here, here, and up front here. And the sequence is 1, 2, 3, 4. You start by tightening in that sequence all by hand first, and then you come back through, tighten everything to 9 Newton meters, sorry, and then you go around the outside and tighten everything to 9 Newton meters. And I'll put that diagram up on the screen. Alright, now we're going to be reinstalling the fuel pressure sensor into the driver's side rail. Specifications per the manual. Make sure you clean this full of all the debris with a carbon choke cleaner. And then it says to coat the threads in diesel, as well as clean the hole. The first step is to tighten by hand. Alright, then you need a 27mm socket and a torque wrench. You can torque it to 60 Newton meters. And then you need to back it out 180 degrees. So get that on there. So 190 degrees would be around facing the other way. Like so. And now it gets torqued to 85 Newton meters. And that is installed. Need to reinstall the fuel rail that spans across the intake. These get tightened down to 25 Newton meters. And while we're on the subject of fuel rails, we did disconnect the rear of the driver's or the passenger side fuel rail. We put that back on, and that's also a 25 Newton meter specification. These get torqued to 9mm. Remember your electrical connection. These are also torqued to 9mm. Sorry, 9 Newton meter. Alright, just finished refilling the oil on this thing. You'll need a T40 Torx bit to drop the drain plug, and that's going to be underneath the shielding you have to take off underneath the engine. Then I refilled it with this right here, some liquid moly Top Tech 4200 5W30, and you'll see on the front here it adheres to the Volkswagen 504 and 50700 standard. I found this at Advanced Tech, or Advanced Auto, sorry, and you'll need 7.7 liters of that oil. Now just the last bit here, I'm getting this cable tray back on, and then we'll make sure everything's routed properly, connect the last of the electrical connectors. We'll take a look at the coolant level, and then I think we'll be pretty close to firing up and making sure we don't have any fuel leaks or anything like that, and see how it runs. Alright, so we've got everything rerouted. Double checked the torque on the fuel lines. Those are 25 Newton meters. I had to get a Crowfoot, 17mm Crowfoot adapter for my torque wrench. Those all check out. All the connections are done over here. Oil's changed, filters changed. And I did top off the coolant reservoir. And also when I was putting the EGR cooler on, I did fill the EGR cooler itself until it started overflowing a little bit. So hopefully I've got enough coolant in the system that it'll purge itself. The coolant vacuum apparatus that I purchased does not work for the coolant reservoir that is on this thing because it's got an extra little side vent hole, so it wasn't able to pull vacuum on the system. So if this all works out, it'll work itself out as far as air goes, and if not, they'll probably just end up taking it to the dealership and doing a coolant flush on it through the dealer. But without further ado, let's give this thing a first start. It'll probably turn over for a minute or two as it builds up fuel pressure, and then we'll come back and check for leaks. Remember to open your garage so the exhaust fumes get out. Just to wrap up, a couple of tools I feel like I would not have done this project without. A set of crow's feet. Really only need the 17 millimeter one, and that is to get proper torque on the fuel line. Also needed this. Hopefully you don't, but I had dropped a couple bolts down inside the V of the engine after the intake was on, and this was really the only way to get it out. You're going to need some of these long reach Torx bits, just really one. Let's see, I think it was the 30. Nope, the 27. And that's really the only way you're going to reach down and get some of those really tight ones down inside the intake for taking that off. The shop vac, this was a game changer here. I was able to get all the oil and coolant that was pooled up really easily cleaned. I could have done it the same, maybe with some rags, but I would have went through, you know, $50 worth of rags. I also did it by taping this little tube on the end of it so I can get down into some of the crevices. And the only thing I would have changed with that is maybe having drained all the oil before doing the job, because there was still quite a bit down inside the oil cooler when I take that off. So if you do it, maybe recommend draining the oil before you get to taking parts off the top of the engine. It might make it a little bit cleaner. It's still going to be a mess, but it might help you out a little bit. And then beyond that, I've put about 100 miles on the project now, or post-project, and I have had no issues. I did a couple small laps around the neighborhood just to warm it up, and towards the end of my first lap, it started to heat up. It got up close to 240, which it normally sits around 200. And so I came in and parked it, let it idle. I took the cap off the expansion tank, which be cautious of doing that because it'll be hot and it'll be under pressure, so it'll let some fluid out. Mine did. And after I burnt that, I took it out for a couple more miles of driving and just light driving, and it's been fine ever since. I drove it with the heat on high, so you're circulating the coolant around in the heater core element as well. And I've not had to bleed anything off since then, and everything seems to be functioning properly. So I'm going to call this a win and a completion of the video. Thanks for watching.